On the south side of Jacksonville, Florida, the kind of neighborhood where front porches felt like extensions of living rooms and every child's laughter echoed down the street, lived an 8-year-old girl whose spirit could brighten even the darkest evening. Her name was Madeline Clifton. Everyone simply called her Maddie. In early November of 1998, the Lakewood community was preparing for the usual shift from humid Florida evenings into the subtle coolness of fall. It was the kind of place where families left doors unlocked, where kids raced their bikes between yards, and where parents felt safe letting their children play outside until the sun dipped behind the tree line. This was home. This was comfort, and this was where everything would change. Before we continue, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Beyond the Case. It helps us bring you more real stories, more investigations, and deeper dives into cases that shaped history. Maddie lived with her father, Steve, her mother, Sheila, and her older sister, Jessie. To those who knew her, she was a burst of pure joy, a girl who could never sit still, whose energy pushed her into every sport she could find. Basketball, football, dance, piano. If it involved movement, creativity, or connection, Maddie was there. Her family remembers her as a child who could not walk past loneliness. If someone sat alone at school, if a kid looked left out on the playground, if a neighbor's child stood quietly at the edge of a group, Maddie would walk straight up to them, extend her hand, smile, and make them part of her world. She was 8 years old, but she carried a compassion that many adults spend their entire lives trying to find. Lakewood was tight-knit, a place where everyone waved at one another, where neighbors borrowed sugar, shared meals, and helped raise each other's kids. The Cliftons were well-liked, and Maddie, always outdoors, became a familiar sight on front lawns, knocking on doors, asking if friends could come out to play. Kids in Lakewood grew up together. Their lives overlapped in driveways, backyards, and tree-lined streets. And so, when Maddie stepped outside on the afternoon of Sunday, November the 3rd, she was simply doing what she had done countless times before. She grabbed a golf club and a few balls and began hitting them up and down the road. To the people who saw her that day, nothing seemed unusual. Just another afternoon. Just another child enjoying the freedom of a Florida evening. But by nightfall, that innocence would shatter. At around 6:30 that evening, Sheila Clifton opened the door and called her daughters in for dinner. Jessie walked into the house alone. She wasn't with Maddie. She didn't know where Maddie was, and neither did anyone else. Sheila felt the first sting of fear, that quiet, creeping worry only a mother can truly understand. She asked neighbors, checked the yards, rang a few doors, but everyone kept saying the same thing. I haven't seen her. She wasn't here. No, Maddie hasn't been around. Minutes passed like hours. The air grew colder, and that uneasy whisper in Sheila's chest turned into a scream. She grabbed the phone and dialed 911. In a trembling voice, she reported her daughter missing. As night fell, the entire neighborhood seemed to awaken. People poured into the streets with flashlights, calling Maddie's name again and again into the dark. Mothers, fathers, teenagers, grandparents, even strangers joined the search. This was no longer one family's fear. This was the community's fear. One neighbor would later say, she was everyone's daughter, everyone's little sister. The sound of Maddie's name echoed through Lakewood, bouncing off fences, drifting through open windows, trembling beneath the flicker of porch lights. But the night offered no answers, no clues, no sign of Maddie. And as dawn broke over Jacksonville, sunlight brought clarity, but not hope. There was still nothing. By the 24-hour mark, the search had grown into something enormous, almost overwhelming. If you were not at work or school, you were out searching for Maddie. Volunteers swept every wooded path. Cars were stopped as they entered and exited the neighborhood. The National Guard searched sewers, ponds, and drainage systems. The FBI joined the investigation. A reward of $100,000 was issued. Helicopters scanned the area from above. But even with hundreds of boots on the ground and thousands of eyes looking for a sign, Nothing surfaced. Not a piece of clothing. Not a footprint. Not a trace. It was as though an 8-year-old child had simply vanished into the air. As detectives canvassed the neighborhood, one man became a point of interest, a neighbor named Larry, who lived just a few houses down from the Cliftons. He told investigators that he had been chipping golf balls in his yard, saw Maddie doing the same, and that she later walked off to retrieve more golf balls. He never saw her again. Larry had a criminal past, arrests from nearly 2 decades earlier for sexual battery charges that were ultimately dropped. He admitted to failing a lie detector test, insisted he had nothing to hide, and allowed investigators to search everything he owned. He became the central focus for a while, but after days of intense questioning, including one interrogation that lasted nearly 8 hours, nothing linked him to Maddie's disappearance. Nothing. Detectives moved outward. Leads stretched farther beyond the neighborhood. Hope began to turn into dread. And then, on the 7th day, a discovery was made. A discovery so horrifying that even hardened investigators struggled to speak of it. Directly across from the Clifton home lived the Phillips family, Steve, Missy, and their 14-year-old son Joshua. They had been helping with the search like everyone else. They had walked the streets, posted flyers, spoken to reporters, and prayed alongside neighbors. Nothing about them seemed unusual. Nothing seemed suspicious. But on the morning of the 7th day, something inside their house began to shift. Missy Phillips walked past her son's bedroom and noticed an odd smell, a smell that had been lingering for days. She assumed it was the birds he kept as pets. His room was messy, cluttered, teenage-level disorganized. She grabbed a trash bag, determined to clean. That was when she noticed a wet spot on his waterbed. She assumed it was a leak. When she lifted the mattress to investigate, she saw that the frame beneath was broken. She began clearing things off the bed, reaching into the frame, pulling out clothes, papers, trash. Then she saw a sock, a small sock, a sock that was stuck. She reached for it. It wouldn't move. Confused, she leaned down. She looked deeper into the darkness beneath the bed. And the next moment, her entire world nearly stopped. A foot. A small, lifeless foot. When Missy Phillips's eyes met the small foot hidden beneath her son's bed, reality seemed to bend. For a moment, her mind refused to accept what her eyes had already confirmed. She blinked once, twice, 3 times, as though her brain was trying desperately to rearrange the image into something harmless, something ordinary, something explainable. But there was no explanation that could soften the blow of what she had found. What Missy saw beneath the bed was the body of a child. She stumbled backward, gasping for breath, as though the air around her had turned into smoke. Her hands shook violently. Her mind began to race denial, confusion, horror, all colliding at once. She did not know whose child it was, but she did not need to. She had seen Maddie's missing person flyer 1,000 times over the past week. She had posted them. She had prayed over them. And now, that same little girl was in her son's bedroom. Missy ran. She did not walk. She ran down the hallway, down the staircase, out the front door, screaming for help. A police officer stationed nearby saw her panic and sprinted toward her. Breathless, she choked out the words she never imagined saying, "There's a body under the bed. My son's bed." She led him upstairs. He knelt, looked under the frame, and what he found sent immediate shockwaves through the investigation. It was Maddie. The 8-year-old child the entire city had been searching for had been inside the home directly across the street all along. News spread like wildfire. Within minutes, police tape wrapped around the Phillips home. More officers arrived. Detectives flooded in. Forensic units, specialists, supervisors. Reporters were not far behind. The quiet Lakewood street, once filled with children riding bikes and families grilling in their yards, was now a crime scene. Parents held each other. Neighbors collapsed in each other's arms. Others fell to their knees in prayer. Many stared in disbelief toward the Phillips home, whispering through tears. How? How could this happen here? How could it be him? Why was she in that house? And then came the question no one dared speak aloud. How did no one know? The heartbreaking detail that shook everyone to the core was this. The police had searched the Phillips home during the week-long search effort. They had walked past the door. They had smelled the odor but assumed it was the birds Joshua kept. They had been inside the room. They had spoken to Joshua, all while Maddie's body was hidden just inches below where he sat. One officer later said, "He was cool as a cucumber, sitting on his bed, petting his dog, calm, relaxed, no emotion." The thought of it still chilled him, because at that very moment as detectives questioned him, as volunteers shouted Maddie's name in the street, as helicopters flew overhead, Joshua Phillips was sleeping above her body, living above it, pretending nothing had happened. This realization brought a heaviness to the entire neighborhood that words could not describe. As investigators worked, they gently lifted Maddie's small body from beneath the waterbed. One of her hands was found clutching the bed frame as though she had reached out in fear or in pain. Officers looked away. Some swallowed back tears. Even the most seasoned detectives would later describe this scene as one of the worst of their careers. The smell, the sight, the silence. Everything in that room told a story far darker than anyone expected. The baseball bat, the pocket knife, the blood, the torn clothing, the confined space where she had been hidden for 6 unbearable days. And then, the most unthinkable part, she had still been alive when Joshua first placed her under the bed. Outside, once the confirmation spread that the body was Maddie's, hundreds gathered in the street. They held hands. They prayed. They cried openly. No one tried to hide their grief. Jacksonville had never experienced a case like this. A missing girl found murdered in the home of a neighborhood teenager. A boy she had trusted. A boy she knocked on the door for, to keep him from being lonely. Reporters captured the raw emotion. The sheriff himself struggled to speak through tears during the press conference. "We found Maddie Clifton this morning. At approximately 7:30, she was deceased." The words cracked in his throat, and with that, the entire city felt the weight of the truth. Joshua's parents were told to come to the police station immediately. His father, Steve, trembling with disbelief, told his son to tell the truth, all of it, and to start talking now. And Joshua did talk. He did not deny killing Maddie, but the story he told raised more questions than answers. He said she had knocked on his door that evening wanting to play, something she had done many times. He told her he had chores and could not stay outside long. They started hitting baseballs together in the backyard. He claimed the ball struck her in the eye by accident. He claimed she screamed. He claimed he panicked, terrified his father would come home and discover he had been breaking the rules. And so, he dragged her inside, so forcefully that her clothing partially came off. When she continued crying, he hit her in the head with the baseball bat. Then, he hid her beneath the bed. Later, when he heard her groaning, he took a pocket knife, cut her throat, and stabbed her repeatedly. He said it was fear, panic, a moment he claimed spiraled out of control. But investigators were not convinced, not even slightly. Missy, Joshua's mother, fell apart upon hearing her son's confession. She insisted that he was a gentle child, quiet, shy, a boy who loved animals, loved his birds, respected adults, and never raised his voice. She begged reporters not to judge him as a monster. But even she could not find words for the reality inside that bedroom, because there was a truth beneath this story that no one could easily accept. A 14-year-old boy killed an 8-year-old girl, and then slept above her body for 6 days. While the entire community searched for her, while her family begged for answers, while volunteers prayed for a miracle just across the street, Lakewood would never be the same again. As the shock of the discovery spread through Jacksonville, detectives shifted instantly into a new phase of the investigation. The frantic search for a missing child was now a murder inquiry, and the only person who could answer the questions that haunted everyone was a 14-year-old boy. What happened in that house on the late afternoon of Sunday, November the 3rd? Why Maddie? Why there? Why him? To find answers, investigators returned to the Phillips home, determined to examine every detail inside the room where the unimaginable had happened. Joshua's bedroom was small, barely large enough for his waterbed, a desk, and a few scattered belongings. Posters hung unevenly on the walls. Clothes littered the floor. Bird cages lined one side of the room, each holding small, colorful birds he adored. But now, the same room held an eerie, suffocating quiet. Evidence technicians meticulously documented everything. The waterbed frame splintered under pressure, the mattress stained, and beneath the wooden slats, the small, confined space where Maddie had been hidden. A baseball bat lay nearby, the same bat investigators later determined had been used to strike Maddie. A pocket knife was found as well, its blade stained, tucked among his belongings, as though nothing were unusual. Her shorts and underwear were discovered near her body removed, but the autopsy indicated no sexual assault had occurred. Investigators could not ignore the disturbing implications. Why were her clothes disturbed at all? What had actually taken place between the two children? These questions loomed heavily in the air. And as forensic specialists moved through the room, one troubling realization continued to surface. Almost none of Joshua's story lined up with the physical evidence. The medical examiner's report would become one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the case. It detailed injuries that painted a far darker picture than Joshua's narrative of panic and accident. Maddie had suffered multiple blows to the head from the baseball bat. She had been stabbed numerous times in the chest. Her throat had been cut. There were signs she had been alive at least briefly after the initial attack, before the fatal wounds were inflicted. The examiner concluded that Maddie had not died immediately. She had been conscious after the initial blows. She had been aware, and she had been hidden under the bed, alive, before the second attack. Those findings shook even experienced investigators. This was not a single moment of fear spiraling out of control. This was multiple stages of violence, separated by time. Time when Joshua had opportunities to seek help, scream for his mother, call for an ambulance, or run outside. But he did none of those things. Instead, he returned and inflicted further wounds to end her life. Detectives and prosecutors began forming their theory of what truly happened. The autopsy contradicted Joshua's explanation of a sudden panic over a strict father. There was no blood trail in the yard or in the hallway leading to his room, suggesting she had not been injured outside as he claimed. If she had been struck outdoors, dragged across grass and concrete, investigators believed they would have found dirt, sand, blood, or fabric fibers on the ground. But they did not. There was none. This pointed to one chilling possibility. Maddie may have been attacked inside the house from the very beginning. Investigators believe Joshua lured her in, not necessarily with malicious pre-planning, but perhaps out of curiosity or experimentation gone wrong, a moment where impulse overshadowed consequence. Still, this remained speculation, and they would not know the truth unless more evidence surfaced during questioning. But for detectives, one fact was clear. Joshua's claims were falling apart. While the investigation intensified behind closed doors, outside, the Cliftons' world fell apart. The moment Maddie's identity was confirmed, her mother, Sheila, collapsed, crying into the arms of family members. Her father, Steve, who had spent every day leading search efforts, stood in disbelief. Some said he stared at the Phillips house in silence, unable to understand how the tragedy had been so close, just across the street. In the days that followed, neighbors delivered food, flowers, cards, candles, anything to show support. Yellow flowers, Maddie's favorite color, decorated fences and walkways. Purple balloons were tied along the neighborhood streets. Reporters captured the grief of an entire community. Parents held their children tighter. Children asked questions adults struggled to answer. How could a place so safe, so familiar, turn into the backdrop of something so devastating? Lakewood would forever carry the weight of that question. On the evening after Maddie's body was found, hundreds gathered in the street for a prayer vigil. Neighbors, teachers, classmates, pastors, and strangers stood together, holding candles that flickered in the cool breeze. The light of the candles illuminated tear-stained faces, grown men wiping their eyes, mothers embracing one another, children clutching stuffed animals. A local pastor spoke softly. "We stand together because we loved her. We stand together because we are broken." and we stand together. Because this community will not be defined by darkness. Across the street, the Phillips house sat silent and dim, windows closed, blinds drawn. Television cameras captured the haunting contrast, the home of grieving parents directly across from the home of the boy who had taken their child's life. The world had shifted in a single morning. Within hours of the discovery, sheriff's deputies read Joshua his rights. He seemed calm, almost unnervingly so, according to some officers. Not hysterical, not angry, not confused. Just quiet. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not deny the allegations. He simply began explaining what he claimed had happened. But detectives kept returning to the same troubling details. His demeanor during the search, his ability to sleep above her body, his lack of outward distress or panic during questioning, his ability to interact normally with neighbors for nearly a week. Some wondered if he fully understood the gravity of what he had done. Others wondered if he understood it all too well. By the end of the night, the sheriff held a press conference. "I am here to announce the arrest of Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips, age 14. The public gasped at the news. A 14-year-old charged with first-degree murder was unheard of in Jacksonville. And yet, here they were, confronting a case so shocking that many struggled to believe it was real. 10 days after Maddie went missing, she was laid to rest. The streets leading to the church were lined with families holding hands, their faces solemn and swollen with tears. More than 1,000 people attended. Her small casket, white with delicate floral designs, was carried past a sea of yellow flowers, symbols of the joy she brought to everyone around her. The pastor spoke of Maddie's kindness, her love of helping others, her bright spirit, and the tragedy of a life cut short. But it was her sister Jessie's quiet sobs that tore through the room. She clutched her mother's hand, unable to comprehend the loss. Outside the church, the sky was clear, the air was still, and for a moment it felt as though the entire city had stopped to mourn a little girl who had touched so many lives. In the days after Maddie's funeral, Jacksonville found itself caught in a storm of grief, disbelief, and a rising hunger for justice. The once quiet Lakewood neighborhood now carried an invisible heaviness, a wound that could not be seen but was felt in every cracked voice, every cautious step, and every lingering stare toward the Phillips home. Maddie's family retreated into their world of heartbreak. The neighborhood retreated into stunned silence. But the justice system moved forward. The tragedy had already shaken the city. What would come next would shock it further. 5 days after Joshua's arrest, on Thursday, November the 19th, a grand jury reached a decision that would set the tone for the entire case. Joshua Phillips would be charged with murder in the first degree, and he would be tried not as a juvenile, but as an adult. This decision was monumental, rare, controversial, and it sent shockwaves far beyond Jacksonville. State Attorney Harry Shorstein stood firmly behind the choice. He addressed the public with a steady but emotional voice. "The citizens of Jacksonville can be assured that every appropriate resource in my office will be devoted to ensuring Maddie Clifton's murderer is brought to justice." These words echoed through news channels, homes, and courtrooms. The community demanded accountability, and the legal system prepared to deliver it. But there was a problem. Jacksonville was no longer a neutral ground. The case had become too large, too emotional, too widely covered. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a memory. Everyone felt connected to the tragedy. So the court made a monumental decision. The trial would be moved. Judge Charles Arnold announced that Joshua's trial would not take place in Jacksonville due to the intense pre-trial publicity. The entire city had been swept into the case, from neighborhood searches to nightly news reports to community-wide vigils. Joshua's lawyer argued that no jury could be unbiased here. No one could separate the emotion from the evidence. No one could ignore the fact that Maddie had been a beloved child in this community. The judge agreed. The trial would be moved to another county, one far enough away to ensure fairness, though many questioned whether fairness was even possible in a case like this. As prosecutors built a case centered on brutality, intent, and contradictions in Joshua's statement, the defense crafted a very different narrative. Joshua's attorney, Richard Nichols, painted a picture of a troubled household, a home where fear was not an abstract concept, but a daily reality. He described Joshua's father, Steve, as a man who struggled with alcohol and drug use, a man who imposed strict rules, a man who could be unpredictable and harsh. Joshua, Nichols argued, lived in a state of constant anxiety, always trying to avoid disappointing his father, always trying not to break the rules. The defense claimed that when Maddie was injured, Joshua panicked, not out of malice, not out of hatred, but out of a terrified child's instinct to avoid punishment. They argued this was not murder in the first degree. This was manslaughter, a tragic accident spiraling into chaos because a frightened boy made terrible, irreversible choices. But the prosecution saw something different, something darker. Prosecutors questioned every part of Joshua's story. If Maddie had been hit by a baseball outside, why was there no blood on the grass? No dirt or debris on her clothing? No signs of a struggle in the yard? Why was every injury consistent with an attack that took place indoors? Why had he removed her clothing if there was no sexual assault? Why hide her under his bed instead of calling for help? Why stab her repeatedly hours after the initial injury? Why cut her throat? Why return again and again with new violence? They argued this was not panic, not fear, not accident. This was intentional, calculated, deliberate, and they had evidence to back it up. As details emerged, people who knew Joshua were left reeling. His principal described him as polite, quiet, and academically strong. Teachers said he never caused trouble. Classmates couldn't reconcile the boy they knew with the crime he had confessed to. A neighbor who often let his 8-year-old son play with Joshua said, "He was a good kid, always respectful, always polite." Even Maddie's own mother, Sheila, admitted she never saw anything concerning about Joshua. Maddie had knocked on his door often. She trusted him. Everyone trusted him. And that, in many ways, was the most disturbing part of all. Joshua was not the boy parents warned their children about. He wasn't the child who caused fights. He wasn't the one who bullied others. He wasn't aggressive, volatile, or strange. He blended in perfectly. No signs, no warnings, no red flags. Just a quiet kid who did something no one could fathom. Joshua's mother, Missy, was devastated not just by the crime, but by the public's judgment. She insisted she had seen no signs that her son was capable of violence. She said in a trembling voice, "So many times I heard people ask what was wrong with our family, what we didn't see. There was nothing to see. Nothing. I came home the night Maddie went missing. There was nothing wrong in my house." Her grief was complex, multi-layered. She mourned the Cliftons' loss. She mourned the boy she thought she knew. And she mourned the future that was unraveling before her eyes. But as the trial approached, the legal system drew a firm line. This was no longer a matter of emotion. It was now a matter of evidence. In the fall of 1999, nearly a year after Maddie's death, the trial of Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips began. He sat quietly beside his attorneys, his face pale, expression unreadable. He did not speak. He did not testify. Not once did he address the court during the trial. The courtroom was packed, reporters lining the back wall, families pressed shoulder to shoulder, community members holding tissues and clutching hands. The Cliftons sat in the front row, their sorrow steady, their eyes fixed on the boy who had taken their daughter's life. The prosecution presented a chilling sequence of events. The defense countered with a story of panic and fear. But the truth, the full truth, remained elusive, tangled between forensic evidence, contradictory statements, and a tragedy that defied rational explanation. The jury listened. The city waited. And the courtroom held its breath. Because everyone knew, whatever verdict came next would change lives forever. The trial of Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips was more than a legal proceeding. It was the emotional climax of a story that had shaken Jacksonville to its core. For nearly a year, the community had searched for reasons, for understanding, for something that could explain the unexplainable. Now, inside a cold courtroom miles away from Lakewood, 12 jurors would be tasked with deciding the fate of a 14-year-old boy who had committed one of the most horrifying crimes the city had ever seen. They had heard the evidence. They had seen the photographs. They had listened to the experts. They had felt the weight of the Cliftons' grief. And now, they had to decide. Joshua's attorney delivered his closing argument with a quiet yet desperate resolve. He stood before the jury and painted a picture of a boy overwhelmed by fear, a child raised in a home of strict rules and unpredictable punishment. He described a household where silence was safer than honesty, where mistakes could lead to anger, and where a boy like Joshua might do anything to avoid disappointing his father. He argued that Maddie's death was a tragedy born out of panic, not malice. A terrible accident, followed by irrational decisions made by a terrified child. He said, Joshua Phillips is not a monster. What he did was horrific, yes, but it began as an accident, and everything that followed spiraled out of fear that bordered on madness. But the defense called no witnesses, not one, not even Joshua. He never spoke, never testified, never explained his side of the story beyond the original confession he had given to investigators. Some believed he was too afraid. Others believed the truth was darker than he claimed. Either way, the courtroom was left with unanswered questions. When the prosecution rose to deliver their closing argument, the tone shifted dramatically. Their words were sharp, deliberate, and unwavering. They told the jury that Joshua's story was built on lies and half-truths. They pointed to the lack of blood in the yard, the lack of dirt on Maddie's clothing, the misplaced timeline, the inconsistencies, the multiple stages of violence. They emphasized that Maddie had been alive under the bed, conscious, injured, terrified, before Joshua returned a second time to stab her repeatedly. They held up a photograph of the baseball bat, then the knife, then the bed frame with its small, impossible space. One prosecutor said, his voice steady but shaken, "There is no version of this story in which this is an accident. No version where this is simply panic. This was intentional. This was deliberate. And this was a choice made again and again and again." The courtroom was silent. Every juror listened closely, their eyes fixed forward, absorbing each word like a weight placed directly into their hands. After closing arguments, the courtroom emptied. Joshua was led away. The Cliftons waited in quiet agony, holding hands, their grief worn into their faces. Hours passed. Then hours more. The air grew still. Reporters whispered. Family members prayed. Deputies paced the hallways. And finally the jury delivered the message that the verdict had been reached. Everyone returned to the courtroom. Joshua was brought in, expression blank. His mother held her breath, tears already forming. The Cliftons sat upright, gripping each other for strength. The judge asked the jury foreperson to stand. The courtroom froze in time. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." Gasps, crying, the sound of Sheila Clifton breaking into sobs as the verdict washed over her like a tidal wave. Joshua did not react, not visibly, not outwardly. He simply stared forward, a 14-year-old child, hearing that he would spend the rest of his life behind prison walls. Shortly after, the judge delivered the mandatory sentence under Florida law at the time. Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips was to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 15 years old. 15. The gravity of those words echoed through the courthouse, through the media, through the city that had mourned Maddie so deeply. At 15, Joshua became one of the youngest inmates in Florida's prison system to receive life without parole. He was given an identification number J11775 and escorted away to begin a sentence that would last the rest of his natural life. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed to capture reactions. Some felt justice had been served. Some questioned whether a 14-year-old should bear the full weight of a life sentence. Some wondered what had driven him to such a dark, violent place. But for the Cliftons, justice was not about satisfaction. It was about closure, the closest thing to peace that could exist in a world where their daughter was gone forever. Sheila Clifton later said, softly, "We will never have Maddie back, but at least we know this won't happen to anyone else." As news of the verdict spread, Lakewood was left with a conflicted sense of relief and sorrow. People were relieved the case was resolved. But they mourned both families, the Cliftons, who had lost a precious daughter, and the Phillips family, who had lost their son to the prison system. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the boy they knew quiet, polite, gentle with the horrifying facts of the case. Some avoided the street entirely. Others placed flowers near the Cliftons' home. Parents spoke to their children about trust, safety, and the hidden dangers that sometimes lurk in plain sight. The playgrounds were emptier, the laughter quieter, and the innocence that had once defined Lakewood was gone. The tragedy had carved a permanent scar across the community, a reminder of how darkness can sometimes hide within the most ordinary places. When the steel doors closed behind 15-year-old Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips, the sound rippled across Florida. It was the final punctuation mark on a case that had shaken the state, broken a community, and left a family mourning a daughter whose light had been extinguished far too soon. Joshua entered the adult prison system as one of the youngest inmates in the state, a teenager surrounded by men twice and 3 times his age, many of whom had committed violent crimes of their own. He would no longer be known as Joshua. He was now inmate J11775. The structure of his life changed instantly. No bedroom, no school hallways, no birds, no neighborhood, no childhood. Just concrete, metal, routine, and time, endless, unbroken time. This was his new reality, and it would last for the rest of his natural life. As the years unfolded inside prison walls, Joshua lived a quiet existence. Officers described him as respectful, obedient, withdrawn, not violent, not disruptive, almost invisible. Other inmates rarely interacted with him. Many didn't know the full extent of his case. Others who did know kept their distance. Crimes involving children often created unspoken divisions in prison populations. Joshua spent his days reading, working, and keeping to himself. Some inmates remarked he seemed frozen in time, a boy who had grown into a man physically, but whose emotional development had halted the day he entered the system. He attended therapy programs, Bible studies, educational courses. He avoided conflict. He didn't seek friendships. He simply endured. But outside those walls, Maddie's legacy continued to live. At Twin Lakes Academy Elementary, where Maddie had once laughed, played, and learned, a memorial playground was built in her name. Bright, inviting, safe, everything that Maddie represented. Parents brought their children there not just to play, but to remember, to teach kindness, to reflect on the fragility of life, to honor a girl who had brought joy to everyone around her. The playground became a place where her spirit lived on, where her compassion echoed, where her smile still felt alive. For the Cliftons, it was a bittersweet comfort, a place to visit, to reflect, and to remember the daughter they had loved so deeply. By his mid-20s, Joshua began speaking publicly from prison, through interviews and written statements. His tone had shifted from the flat, emotionless demeanor seen during his trial to someone grappling with guilt, shame, and regret. He said, "Every time I think about what I missed out on, I think about what she missed out on. I put myself in a fantasy world for years, pretending it hadn't happened. That was my way of surviving." He described nights of crying alone in his cell, days spent wrestling with memories he couldn't escape, an adulthood haunted by a childhood crime. Joshua said he developed empathy the hard way, by living in constant awareness of pain, suffering, and consequence. He admitted there were moments when ending his own life seemed like the only way out of the darkness. But he said one thing kept him alive. "My mother, I couldn't put her through that." Those words revealed the complex emotional landscape behind bars, a mixture of remorse, fear, and a lingering sense of responsibility toward the woman who had discovered the unthinkable beneath her son's bed. In the year 2012, the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark decision. Mandatory life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. The ruling stated that children should not automatically be condemned to die in prison because their brains, decision-making abilities, and emotional development were not fully formed. This ruling shook the foundation of countless cases across the nation, including Joshua's. For the first time since he entered prison, Joshua had a chance. Not at freedom, but at reconsideration. His case was eligible for resentencing. For the Clifton family, the news reopened wounds they had spent years trying to heal. For the Phillips family, it opened a small window of hope, a hope they were almost afraid to embrace. And for the legal system, it meant revisiting one of the darkest chapters in Jacksonville's history. In the year 2017, nearly 2 decades after the murder, Joshua was brought back to court for a resentencing hearing. He was no longer the quiet, pale teenager from the original trial. He was a grown man in his early 30s, with deep lines etched into his face and a heaviness in his eyes that only time in prison can create. The courtroom once again filled with reporters, community members, and the Clifton family. Old wounds reopened. Old grief resurfaced. The evidence technician who had found Maddie under the bed described the scene again, his voice cracking as he recalled the details. Joshua sat hunched, eyes lowered, unable to look at anyone as the horrors of the past were spoken aloud. But this time, Joshua took the stand. He addressed the Clifton family directly. With trembling hands and a voice cracking from emotion, Joshua delivered a 5-minute statement that he said he had waited nearly 20 years to give. He said, "I do not pretend to understand your pain. I do not pretend to grasp the void I created in your lives. But I do understand suffering, and I do understand guilt. I have spent my entire life trying to become someone better because I know that I can never undo what I did." He spoke of despair, shame, and the darkest moments of his imprisonment. He spoke of wanting to die, but choosing to live for his mother's sake. He spoke of growth, therapy, and the slow development of empathy. He ended by saying, "I am so deeply, deeply sorry." The courtroom was silent. Some cried. Some stared blankly. Some felt conflicted. Nothing he said could ever bring Maddie back. But for the first time, the Cliftons heard his regret in his own voice. After hours of testimony, statements, and emotional recounting, the judge faced a heavy task, determining whether Joshua deserved a chance at parole. The judge acknowledged the tragedy, the pain, the irreversible loss. He acknowledged Joshua's remorse and his years of good behavior in prison. Then, he delivered his decision. Joshua's life sentence would be upheld, but he would now have the possibility of parole several decades in the future. This meant Joshua would spend the majority of his life behind bars, with only a small chance at release when he was much older. For the Cliftons, this was a measure of relief. For the Phillips family, it was a sliver of hope. For the community, it was a complicated mixture of justice, sympathy, and unresolved emotion. In the years that followed Joshua Phillips's resentencing, Jacksonville carried the memory of Maddie Clifton like a scar beneath the skin, one that never fully healed, but remained a reminder of the fragility of childhood and the weight of unimaginable choices. The story did not fade. It did not disappear. It lived through whispered conversations, late-night reflections, and the quiet ache of the families involved. What happened on that Sunday afternoon in Lakewood was something the community would never forget. But the world kept spinning, and with it, new layers of understanding and legacy began to form. The Clifton family was forever changed. Steve and Sheila Clifton had lost their youngest daughter, a vibrant child whose joy lit up every room she entered. After Maddie's murder, their home felt different. The air was quieter. The spaces where she once played were still. Her toys, her clothes, her drawings, they remained, but in a way that seemed frozen in time. Every holiday, every birthday, every empty chair at the dinner table was a painful reminder of what had been taken from them. And yet, the Cliftons kept Maddie's spirit alive. They spoke of her often. They visited her playground. They shared stories of her kindness. They protected her memory fiercely. The community supported them. Neighbors helped. Friends visited. People brought meals, left flowers, and wrote cards. But grief like theirs never truly ends. It simply changes shape. Across the street, the very street where Maddie once ran barefoot with joy, the Phillips home became a symbol of a different kind of pain. Missy Phillips, Joshua's mother, was thrust into a nightmare she could never have imagined. She had found Maddie's body. She had turned her own son in. She had lost the child she thought she knew. Her grief was a complicated one. She mourned Maddie. She mourned Joshua. She mourned the life she believed they were building. Public judgment fell hard on the Phillips family. People whispered. Some blamed them. Some believed they must have missed warning signs. Missy insisted there were none, no violence, no anger, no cruelty in Joshua. Just a quiet boy. But the weight of public scrutiny, combined with her personal horror, was overwhelming. She once said, with tears in her voice, "As a parent, you question everything. Was I too strict, too lenient? Did I miss something? I didn't see anything. Nothing. And that is something I live with every day." Her husband, Steve Phillips, battled his own demons: guilt, confusion, anger, shame. Their home, once filled with routine and normalcy, became a symbol of a crime that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Lakewood changed after Maddie's death. Children who once played freely were kept closer to home. Parents who once trusted their neighbors with ease now carried a quiet fear. The sound of laughter on the streets softened. People planted flowers in Maddie's honor. They placed teddy bears along fences. They prayed for both families. Even decades later, residents who had lived through the tragedy spoke about it with a heaviness in their voices, as though the memory had carved a permanent place inside them. One neighbor said, "She was everyone's daughter. Everyone felt responsible. Everyone felt the loss." Another said, "We didn't just lose Maddie. We lost part of our innocence." The case of Maddie Clifton and Joshua Phillips became one of the most talked about crimes of the late 1990s. Newspapers ran front-page stories. Television networks aired specials. Documentaries were made. Journalists traveled to Jacksonville from across the nation. The idea that a 14-year-old boy, a boy with no criminal record, no history of violence, no sign of disturbance, could commit such a crime fascinated experts and horrified families. Psychologists debated the case. Criminologists analyzed the evidence. Social workers studied the patterns. Everyone wanted to make sense of the senseless. But some crimes defy explanation. Joshua Phillips's case became a reference point for conversations about juvenile justice, mental health, impulsive violence, and the complexity of adolescence. It also became a cautionary tale, a reminder that darkness can sometimes hide where no one expects it. Despite the grief, despite the pain, despite the unimaginable tragedy, Maddie's legacy did not fade into shadow. Her playground remains a symbol of joy, a place where laughter still rises into the air, just as she would have wanted. Children who never knew her play beneath the shade of trees planted in her name. Teachers tell her story, not the violent end, but the loving, compassionate life she lived. Her empathy, the way she approached lonely children, the way she pulled others into her circle, inspired memorial initiatives focused on kindness and connection. Even now, many years later, people remember Maddie not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. Bright, kind, fearless, full of love. Her family says she would be proud of that legacy. But despite healing, despite years passing, despite therapy, community support, and legal closure, one question still lingers in the minds of many. Why? Why did Joshua do it? Prosecutors had theories, but no definitive motive. Psychologists proposed explanations rooted in adolescent brain development. Some believe Joshua's fear of his father triggered irrational decisions. Others suspected deeper, unspoken issues. But the truth, the complete truth, has never been fully known. Only 2 children were in that backyard on that November afternoon. One is gone forever. The other has spent his life behind bars. Whatever happened between them in those final moments is a secret locked away forever. In the end, this case became more than a crime, more than a loss, more than a trial. It became a symbol of community, of grief, of the fragile line between innocence and darkness. It is a reminder that tragedy can unfold anywhere, at any time, even in the quietest of neighborhoods, even in the brightest of homes. And it is a story that continues to be told, not because people want to relive the pain, but because remembering Maddie means honoring her life, her joy, her kindness, her spirit, and ensuring that her legacy never fades. The story of 8-year-old Maddie Clifton is one that still echoes through Jacksonville, through Florida, and through the American true crime landscape decades after it unfolded. It is a tragedy that raised countless questions about safety, about juveniles who commit violent acts, about family dynamics, and about the unpredictable nature of human behavior. But as the years have passed, something deeper has taken shape. A reflection on justice, memory, forgiveness, and the lingering ache of what could have been. This final chapter is not just about the aftermath. It is about the world that Maddie left behind, and how her story continues to shape the people and the community that loved her. Jacksonville has grown, expanded, changed. New families have moved into Lakewood, streets have been repaved, houses remodeled, playgrounds updated, and businesses replaced. But there is a quiet, unspoken understanding among longtime residents. They never forgot. Those who lived through that November of 1998 still remember the search helicopters circling above, the scent of cold autumn air, the tremor in the sheriff's voice during the press conference, and the rows of yellow flowers laid in Maddie's honor. The Cliftons' old home remains a landmark in local memory. The Phillips home across the street became a symbol of trauma and unanswered questions. And the space between the two houses, a simple stretch of neighborhood road, carries a weight only the community understands. Even now, when longtime residents drive past, they slow down, stare for a moment, and remember, beyond Jacksonville, Maddie's case became a touchstone in discussions of juvenile justice. Law schools, criminology courses, psychology classes, and legal seminars often reference the case when examining juvenile brain development, impulsive violence, mandatory sentencing for minors, child-on-child homicide, the complexities of adolescent decision-making. Joshua Phillips's case sits at the intersection of these topics, raising difficult questions. Should a 14-year-old be judged with the full weight of adult law? Can a child who commits murder truly be rehabilitated? Is life without parole for a juvenile ever a fair sentence? And what weight should be given to the suffering of the victim's family? There are no simple answers. Experts still debate them. But every debate comes back to one undeniable truth. A child lost her life, and another child's life ended in a different way on that same day. Two families shattered. An entire city transformed. When the Supreme Court ruled in the year 2012 that mandatory life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional, the nation looked back on past cases like Joshua's, through a different lens. The court acknowledged that children are fundamentally different from adults in terms of emotional development, impulse control, understanding of consequences, ability to change over time. This decision did not excuse the crimes. It did not erase the pain. But it forced the system to consider growth, rehabilitation, and human development. Joshua Phillips became a name repeatedly cited in legislative discussions, legal journals, and advocacy groups across the country. His case became part of a national conversation about how society should handle young offenders who commit serious crimes. Some states changed their laws. Some courts reviewed old sentences. Some families felt hope, others felt fear, anger, or betrayal. For the Cliftons, the ruling reawakened old wounds, but also reaffirmed their belief that Maddie's life should remain the central story. Not the legal debates, not the public arguments, not the theories, just Maddie. To this day, one of the most haunting aspects of the case is the lack of a clear motive. Joshua's explanation never fully satisfied investigators. Psychologists proposed possibilities: impulse, adolescent fear, emotional immaturity, panic triggered by strict household rules. But no single theory encompasses the truth. There was no history of violence, no warning signs, no pattern that predicted what would happen. The reality that two children were alone in that backyard and that only one survived leaves a permanent void in the narrative. Some believe Joshua himself may not fully understand the why. Some believe he knows but cannot confront it. Others believe the truth is simply too dark, too complex, or too painful to articulate. Whatever the reason, that missing piece is part of what made the case unforgettable. While the world focused on Joshua, His mother Missy carried an invisible burden that few could truly understand. She spent years visiting him behind prison glass, seeing her son grow into adulthood in a place he was never meant to be. Her life became a balancing act between grief and guilt, loyalty and sorrow, self-blame and self-defense. She supported him, but she mourned Maddie too. She felt compassion for the Cliftons, yet she also felt the loneliness of being a parent whose child had become the source of unimaginable pain. Her story is rarely told, but it is part of the tragedy. She once said, "I lost my son that day too, and I lost the trust of a community I loved. Sometimes, I think I lost myself." The Phillips family was not excused from suffering. They simply suffered in silence. But through all the pain, through the hearings, through the media coverage and legal battles, one thing has remained constant: Maddie's light. Her memory is preserved in stories told by her family about her kindness, her endless energy, her love of sports, her musical talent, her compassion for lonely kids. Her legacy is etched into the playground that bears her name, a place where children climb, laugh, and run, just as she once did. Parents bring their children there to learn not just about tragedy, but about kindness, connection, inclusion, empathy, everything Maddie embodied. Her family often says, she would want the world to be kinder. She would want people to look after each other. That was who she was. And in many ways, that is exactly what she left behind. A reminder that kindness matters deeply, especially in a world where tragedy can strike unexpectedly. As this chapter of Beyond the Case closes, the story of Maddie Clifton stands as a testament to both the fragility and the resilience of human life. It reminds us that evil can hide in unexpected places. Grief can unite communities. Justice can be complicated. And the legacy of a child can outshine even the darkest of tragedies. Maddie's story continues to be told not to sensationalize, not to exploit, not to reopen wounds, but to honor a life cut short and to remind the world that every child's life is precious. Her name lives on. Her light continues to shine. And the world remembers her not for the horror of her final moments, but for the beauty of her short, radiant life. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a case that changed a community forever. If you found meaning in this story, remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to support Beyond the Case. Your support helps us continue sharing the stories that matter, the stories that must never be forgotten.